It's like, yeah, I mean, everything up until now has been plenty controversial, but it takes some explaining to get people to understand why it would be controversial because we think we know what he's saying, but actually he's saying something else. But this is the first section where we think it's crystal clear what he's saying, and we're against it. Except here too, he's not saying what we think he's saying. um, so we might as well dive into the controversy, right? Let's uh, let's get started. So we're for for those just joining us, this is the Kenneth Smith philosophy series, and we've been for 82 sessions focusing on his forthcoming book Millennia and Microcosm, which he wrote as a series of columns in the back of the Comics Journal back in the 1998, 99, 2000 time frame. And David and I are going to be putting it together into a book. We are in chapter 4 after 82 weeks. We are still in chapter 4, but we hit a milestone last week. Yeah, she's in Florida, and the milestone that we made last week is that we actually finished section F, which we've been on for ages. Section F was on mythos and logos, and it was because it takes a long time to convey the idea that a myth isn't a lie, that a myth isn't any old story that's popular. We don't get to say, oh, people used to believe the earth was flat. That was a myth. I mean, in a modern definition, sure. I mean, words mean whatever moderns decide they mean, like the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland. But to the Greeks who coined the phrase mythos, myth meant the opposite of that. Myth is a truth, and it's a particularly difficult but important truth, and it can only be conveyed through stories. Because it's not about measurable things, but it's about more important things than that. So we spent a long time on section F, but we finished it. And I'm going to, just out of not entirely just out of a perverse sense of hilarity, um, I'm going to requote for us in the chat the very last sentence of section F because it sets up the rest of chapter 4. He says, to comprehend the orbital decay of ancient culture, however, we need some further exposition. So the purpose of G and H in chapter 4 is to help explain what happened to the Greeks. If everything up through section F is a description of what the Greeks believed, part by part, building up, incrementally this worldview that's very alien to ours, then section G and F are going to explain what happened to them. And in order to do that, section G actually doesn't so much talk about the orbital decay. That's section H. So we're gonna get into that. He's going to talk about sophistry in section H. But in section G, he's putting together all of the ideas from chapter 4 into kind of one coherent picture. And when he does that, it requires explicating an idea that we've only touched on in the previous sections in chapter 4. And that's the idea of the relationship between character and class. We'll dive into this in a moment, but the place to begin with this is with a recognition that we've talked before about the idea that the Greeks were a class society. They were a conquering society. They had invaded along with the Proto-Indo-Europeans from the Caucasus Mountains. Thousands of years before, their ancestors had set up on the western shore of the Black Sea, and then split into 3 different groups that moved into Europe as conquering invaders with chariots. And they had a patriarchal class-based system. They had a system based on animal labor, the labor of women, but above all, their new innovation, which made the Yamnaya explode out and spread across Asia and Europe, was this new idea of you could conquer entire peoples and make them do all the work for you. That was the new idea. And the reason that you do that is not just because you're lazy, but because the time you save by not having to attend to your own life, by having other people having no choice but to take care of your life, is that you could focus full time on military prowess. The Yamnaya were military innovators on a level never before seen in the world. And as a result, they beat everybody everywhere they went. They conquered everybody wherever they went. They enslaved them, turned them into a new low class, that they were the bottom class, and the Yamnaya would be the upper class, or the descendants of the Yamnaya. And then once they had the position of power, they then were stuck with more existential problems. And those existential problems included things like, how do I keep my neighboring Proto-Indo-Europeans from changing directions and coming and trying to conquer me? So they got real interested in stopping each other. The longer they'd been apart from each other, the more their languages diverged and their religions diverged, and they stopped recognizing each other as belonging to the same group. And they started thinking about, well, how do I stop those guys from taking over? That became one of their problems. So there's a sort of a cycle of military escalation that begins with the invasion of Europe that hasn't stopped to this day. And then, but the bigger problem is to take a thing and to have a thing are two very different states. So, okay, you are the invading Hellenes. You have taken over the Greek peninsula. You have enslaved all of the various indigenous peoples there. They work for you. You're wealthier than you've ever been in your entire lives. Your ancestors couldn't dream of being this wealthy. Now what? And the answers that they came up with initially weren't all that good, and they weren't very satisfying. They had bad dreams about all the dead bodies that they left behind. Gilbert Murray talks about this in Five Stages of Greek Religion, that a great deal of Greek religion begins with trying to find ways to placate the dead, to honor the dead, not just your own dead, but especially to honor the dead of those ancestors of the people you conquered. Because, those people needed to make their peace with being slaves. And if you continue to insult them and hold them in contempt all the time, then you're likely to have uprisings. The city states that used contempt and sneering, to dominate their lower classes tended to get into a lot of trouble with slave revolts. So Gilbert Murray talks about the way that instead they would set up shrines and festivals honoring the fallen dead of the indigenous folks. And then they would also reframe the concept of who they were to include the lower classes. And they would say, we aren't two people, one of whom is your enemy who came in and took everything from you. We are one people. We're all going to speak the same language. We're all going to have the same gods. We're not going to fight amongst each other. And therefore, when we praise ourselves, you can take it that we are also praising you, right? Because we're all Hellenes. And as part of that system of praise, as part of the obfuscation of what they'd done, they needed to come up with a justification for their class system that wasn't, haha, we conquered you and now everything that you had is ours. They needed a better justification for that. So they invented this schema in which they said classes are not something that we've imposed by the sword and the chariot. Classes are intrinsic to human beings. Human beings come in different varieties. And those varieties include people who are more full of life and initiative and strategy and can work together well on the one hand, and these people should be the upper class. And then on the other hand, you have people who are more passive and they don't take initiative well, they don't think very well, they're confused, they need someone to govern them or else they can't run their lives satisfactorily, and these will be the lower class. And this became the initial justification to help them live with what they'd done. The longer that they worked on that justification, especially because they began to inform it, to make it really stick, to make it have traction, they studied human nature, they studied the people around them, and they looked for characteristics that could justify why somebody should rule or why somebody should not rule. They also had experience with city-states that were run badly for a time, and they had to figure out, well, what went wrong in those cases. So they began diagnosing, these are the sorts of people who are not fit to govern. These are the sorts of people who are fit to govern. And the consequence of this, when they began matching it up to their kind of self-satisfying, rationalizing class system, is they began to develop something that they hadn't intended to, which is they began to develop a genuinely scientific model of the diversity of human beings. And in that diversity, they only partly found the justification for their class system. Because what they found instead is the class system that they felt that they ought to have rather than the one that they actually had. And the one that they actually had, there were too many people in charge who were idiots. and there were too many people of high character who were slaves. And so Aristotle, writing about these different political systems, begins, and I don't think he's the first, but he begins saying very clearly that people who are slaves but have the character of Aristoi, it's a crime to keep them as slaves. They should be freed and they should rise to fit the level of their character. And likewise, people who are ruling, whether as an individual or in an oligarchy or in a democracy, people who have risen, who are up at the high points, but whose character is that of a slave, those people should sink, and they should go down to the class that fits them, because they're people who are manifestly unfit to govern others. They don't even govern themselves well. They really need somebody to govern them. And that arrangement is only possible in a class-based society if they're not at the upper class. They need to be at one of the lower classes. At some point in here, they begin to split their stratification into not just an upper and a lower, but two lower classes. So you got the douloi, you've got the banausoi, and both of those are lower classes. And then at the top, you have the aristoi. I asked Kenneth Smith about this once, about the role of the aristoi and to what extent did the Greeks recognize it. And he says that the Greeks didn't understand it at first. It was they sort of had this idea that the crafts, the skilled labor, even though it's no longer laboring with your whole body, even though it's a kind of work, it still should be some kind of slave level caste. It should be they tried to lump them in with the douloi originally, but the problem is, what characterizes banausoi is their hypernoesis. And if you have noesis, among other things, you get very good at systems, including schemes and plans. You can fool people. You can learn how to trick people about your own character, if you're good at it, if you study how to do it. And so the Greeks often confused, when they were trying to sort banausoi, they intended to sort them into a lower class, but sometimes they sorted them into an upper class. And this is part of the critique that Aristotle and others, including Diogenes, have of late Greek society after the Peloponnesian War, is that Greek society's schema for what the class system ought to be makes sense, but when we compare the actual classes and distribution of population within any given polis, we find it's broken. We find people ruling who are not fit to rule. Diogenes, with his lantern in the marketplace, is a critique of the free, i.e. upper class people of Athens, saying, I don't see anybody here who should count as an Aristos. Like, somehow we've screwed this thing up, he's saying, in effect. And likewise, when Aristotle does his comparisons, he's saying the same thing. So what we're going to get into in section G, character and class, in chapter 4, we're going to get into this issue of what did the Greeks think they were doing with their class system? What was it they meant to do versus what they actually did? And so as we talk about these issues of, are there people who deserve to be slaves and things like that, we're going to be constantly struggling between, are we talking about the actual class system that the Greeks had or different city-states had, and comparing and contrasting them? Are we talking about what the US did with slavery and other European nations, during the modern epoch? What exactly do we mean by this? What are we advocating for? Before we get into it, I can tell you the very first time I heard Kenneth Smith talking about some people by character are slaves. I was raised in the civil rights movement. My very first reaction was, no, what's wrong with you? I had very strong feelings about that. And when he starts saying that people aren't equal, my first reaction is, equality is the good thing. And it took a long time for me to get separated from my programming to be able to look at things like, did Martin Luther King Jr. say everybody's equal? Or did he say he dreamed of a world where his children would be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin? Is he saying we're all identical, and we should all be treated as identical? Or is he saying there are distinctions that matter between people, but we're making the wrong distinctions? It's not that discrimination is wrong. It's that discrimination on the basis of things that are completely irrelevant, such as, the color of your skin, or your sexual preferences has nothing to do with your quality as a human being. Other things are related to your quality as a human being. So this is a whole big complicated area, and I don't know how long it's going to take us to get through chapter G. Maybe it will prove less controversial than I think, except that there's 4 hands up already. So I rather think I predict correctly. This is going to be the chewiest part of chapter 4. Let's start with Stephen. Come off mute, Stephen, and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Yum Naya. Yes, I've been coming across that over the years, and there seems to have been, in the last year or so, some big changes in the attitude, or seems in the attitude to that culture. It apparently was a classic sort of steppe culture, which hit, or struck settled people and just overran them. The interesting thing, though, the Yamnaya don't seem to have been the ancestors of the extensive Europeans. It was this other culture called the corded ware. Interesting, when they do the genetic analysis, the Yamnaya and the corded ware were from a very close ancestor. The corded ware developed in northern Europe and a place outside the classic steppe, so it must have been something of a shock. A classic steppe culture overruns the steppes and goes into a region which their culture's not used to. And beside them, you had the Yamnaya. The Yamnaya don't seem to have left much ancestry in Europe. But this other group, which is virtually the brother of it genetically, did become the great ancestor of many groups in Europe. I don't know. You have sort of come across anything recent, have you? Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, it changes almost every year. Basically, we're in the golden age of genetic archaeology. And I mean, every single year there are enormous, like a dozen or more big breakthroughs in our understanding of European ancestry every year now. And partially it's because they're going back to remains and running higher quality genetic analyses on them than they ever did before, and then cross comparing that with populations all over Europe to try to figure out who's related to whom. So when I first started looking at the Proto-Indo-European invasion of Europe, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, we didn't know much. It was a really arm wavy picture of, okay, we knew they came from over there and they went over here, and then we're not sure. Now we can subdivide it all the way to when did the different groups retreat from the Ice Age south? The indigenous Europeans retreated into Spain and Italy, as the ice advanced prior to 20,000 BCE. And then when the ice retreated, we used to say, well, they went back into Europe. But now we're able to trace different groups moving, around the Alps or going east or crossbreeding. And so this is where we get into the corded ware groups, is when some of the indigenous European traveling groups moving north, meet the descendants of the Yamnaya, and as you say, you get sort of these sibling populations that become then the protogenitors of the next wave that moves out. But I don't dare summarize it now, because next year I'll be wrong, or rather next year it'll just sound like a cartoon by comparison, because as you point out, there's all these details to it about which groups at which times. But what we can say is that the corded ware, the Yamnaya descendants, their genetic markers are all over Europe. The thing that's happened now that's been more interesting is being able to find the genetic markers of the different other indigenous groups, and when did they cross with the Yamnaya? Where was the ancestry? Partially, it comes from looking at mitochondrial DNA versus the main DNA within the body, and seeing, and also Y chromosome DNA, comparing and contrasting to figure out what's coming down through the male lines, what's coming down through the female lines, and so forth. So, I did a post on this about 2.5 years ago on Facebook, and it's obsolete now. So, it'll be obsolete next week, I'm sure. But the general picture we do have, which is that there were a number of original populations in Europe um, that survived the Ice Age. There was a second wave that, after they repopulated moving north, there was a second wave that came in from Anatolia and brought agriculture. And that took about 2,000 years to cross Europe and reach the British Isles, for example. And these were the people that set up the standing stones. These were the people that, they were Neolithic, so they're using stone for their architecture. They don't have bronze, they don't have iron. So there's limits to where they can grow things. Um, but that population was stable for quite a long time until it was hit by what looks like the Black Death. Our old friend Pestis, um, the same guy that hits Europe later on, appears to have hit the Neolithic populations in Europe and half depopulated Europe. When the third wave comes, the descendants of the Yamnaya move in from the Caspian Black Sea region. Uh, they find it pretty easy going because they're a vital, healthy culture, and they're moving into a place that was depopulated just a few centuries before. So that partially explains what happened. But part of it is the innovation of a class system, the class system that the Indo-Europeans brought, which is baked into the language. You can see terms related to class going all the way back to Proto-Indo-European. This concept of we need to get other people to work for us so that we can focus on war and politics and be really great at war and politics. This is not only something that was an innovation that they brought in, but the Greeks knew it. They knew that was their thing. They talked about it relentlessly. This was the job of the upper class. This was the job of the aristoi. The aristoi were the warrior caste, and the warrior caste were the ones who they felt were qualified to lead. Um, so it's very interesting stuff that's happening here. Um, it's a great question, Stephen. Phil, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I guess the first thing that came to my mind was that uh, although the Mycenaeans were considered, I guess, early Greeks, they were not Greeks at all, in a way, right? Because they were not Dorian or Ionian or Corinthian. Neither were the um, uh, Minoans, although we should concentrate on the Mycenaeans because that's where the Trojan War, the heroic Trojan War was supposed to take place. So they had to incorporate that because that was part of the myth, right? And my thought is that how do you then conquer a population that has a very powerful myth? And how do you incorporate it? I guess you recategorize things. You sort of like what's the word that I want to get is like uh, you revise revisionism. You revise the structure, and so you have these categories. And then the second thought I had was that, hey, this reminds me a hell of a lot of Kant's categorical imperative applied a different way, right? Because you have these categories you fall into now, instead of using it as Kant used it, you use it as a categories, the characters, rather than the category of the world itself. So that's interesting. In other words, these categories, and in some ways, Kant is that way too. I have the feeling, although I don't know Kant well enough, is you have the structure, you have the form, you have the answer. Now you're looking for the reason to, to put it. So, which then expose the fact that categories are not top down. You have a top down structure, and you're looking for a synthetic thing to fill in the category. It's kind of like it's kind of like what's his name? Uh, who was the mayor of New York that ran all those things? Yeah, yeah. Mayor, the guy that ran for Trump.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. So he's saying, "Oh yeah, we have all the theory. We're just looking for the for the data, to justify it. We got all of the theories. It's there." as long as we find it. Of course, they couldn't find the reason to fill out the category, so to speak, and justify it. So, which means everything is. Then I begin to think, yeah, in Kant there's the analytic uh, a priori, and there's a synthetic a priori. And it seems to me when I look at the analytic a priori, they're all definitional. I mean, they're ideas that are not connected, right? Like, all bachelors of arts unmarried men. I mean, okay, what new information do you tell me there? I mean, it's sort of like an identity sign. Uh, and then all the other ones, I'm always thinking, well, how could synthetic stuff that came from imperial experiences, how could they become a priori? Well, because they could become a priori because they're a posteriori justification for the for the a priori structure. So
Yeah.
in some sense, all of it, and I'm beginning now to wonder about mathematics, whether that's not a synthetic a priori rather than, you know, a sort of analytic. And when you think about analytic, is it you're building up, I mean, is it coming out of the thing you analyze and deconstruct it, or are you analyzing it backwards and sort of find the thing, which is exactly what we're talking about here. So a justification for it. So it almost seems like, the analytic a priori is almost a top-down imperial system that in a sense that is used to justify it, and therefore in a sense silently oppress the
Right.
structure,
Right.
which is very, very, very interesting. Like this is the way it is. It's like, but it was actually synthetic,
Yeah.
and now we could use to justify it as an imperial system that justify
Yeah.
the oppression, because nothing personal. This is just the way it is.
That's right.
So that's very interesting. I don't mean to like brush aside all of this stuff, nor shine a dark light on Kant, because I actually like Kant, but but there is a funny sort of how should I say, the grit we built may be a very warped grit. Let's put it that way.
Thanks, Phil.
That's it. I'm sure Donna will object.
No, it's great. Yeah, I mean, there is an interesting sequence here where, first you win, then you get tired of fighting uprising after uprising, so you have to come up with a rationalization for your victory that will help people to make peace with your victory. And the more successful you are, your rationalization is more successful if it coheres with reality. If it doesn't resemble reality, the people on the bottom are going to look around and go, no, that doesn't describe this world. So no, that I'm still going to have an uprising. But if it describes reality really well and offers a rationalization, then you get into the problem where the better it describes the reality, the more out of sync it will it will turn out to be. As it becomes more realistic incrementally over the decades, it will become, rather than a rationalization, it becomes a critique, because in fact that's not how you ended up in top. You ended up in top because you came in on chariots and swords and kicked ass, and some of you are idiots. You don't deserve to be on top. So the more you end up describing clearly who should rule, the more you end up indicting at least part of your own class as they're not actually fit to rule, which retroactively, rather than justifying your conquest, it calls the whole thing into question. So there's kind of the ground firming up and then somehow sliding away underfoot that's happening over the centuries with the Greeks. And by the time you get to the Peloponnesian War, the Greeks don't believe in it anymore. I mean, they believe in the system, they believe in the justification the abstract system that resembles reality rather than the concrete system that they stood up, which isn't actually fair and isn't really working. So there's an interesting tension that develops out of this. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Good to see everybody. It's interesting because like where you started the conversation was the regarding Aristotle and his perspective on ethics. And I think that that's really, really important when you're actually talking about character in particular. So the idea this we have these intellectual virtues and these moral virtues, right? And I think making that distinguishing between those two is actually very important because sometimes we tend to overvalue the intellectual and discount the moral. And one is fairly quantitative, the other one isn't. And this is kind of where we get into the categorizations of determining what is good and what is bad and all these other things. And this is where we can say that certain forms of modernity is obviously failing in the sense that you're categorizing right off the bat, and you're able to say that this is good. You have a high IQ, you're good. And I mean, and it's like, well, no, you could have a high IQ and do some really unfortunate things in the process, right? So this importance between this of being able to sort out how our moral character is developed and how our intellectual character is developed are two different things, and they work together. And so from that perspective, it's like the moral aspect, look at, kind of sets the ends in mind, the ideals, right? And that comes from a variety of different ways, right? And then there's the intellectual allows us to think about those ends. But how we think about those ends is where it gets interesting, because that's where we start to say, well, is it just strictly quantitative? Or is it strictly one way of looking at it? Or are we informed through stories? How does the intellect actually get developed for judgment to make sure that our ends that we're setting, the moral ends that we're claiming that are good, that we're actually on the journey there? That to me is where you're refining your actions. And that's important because that's your character. That your actions essentially aligning with what your values are, which, or your moral development, moral character, moral virtue, I mean, that's what I'm basically trying to say is that if you're looking at things from those two perspectives, that you wouldn't necessarily allow certain things like superficial traits, like slavery, or discriminating, categorizing people based off of X, Y, and Z, color, whatever it may be. You wouldn't approach it from that perspective. Like it's not really doesn't make sense. So the point is that this is a very it's contextually based. Each situation is unique, and our ability to refine our judgment is based off of a lot of different things, as Kenneth has covered, like a lot of the categories, all the categories that he's covered, not just simply looking at it from a very narrow kind of quantitative categorizing people type of way. And I just think that that's kind of getting to the heart of what we're kind of discussing here, is that how do we act in the world in a way that is not a narrow perspective, that gives us the full understanding, or as much understanding as possible, uh, understanding other people's perspectives, understanding stories. So if we go back to things like, you know, how stories inform us in general of other people's consciousness and allows us to connect with them. Like, so if you're, you know, you wouldn't necessarily have want someone, if you connected with someone, you wouldn't see them as a slave if you heard their story. That's my point. But if you look at it from strictly narrow perspective, where you're just looking at it as people as a means to an end, then you would. But my point being is that this is these are different schools of thought, and this is why we need to be careful when we start to take very narrow perspectives and approaches towards refining our judgment overall. And this is why character is so important. And so it'll be interesting to unpack how Kenneth, he already has for us, is basically going to pull this together, everything that we've talked about in this last section, not last section, but on this page anyway, but how he pulls everything together as to how we can develop the habits that actually allow us to achieve a moral ends that we would want, that would be desirable, and that would be just. And it comes back to the idea of having principles to rely on as well. Anyway, that's
It's good.
a lot of stuff, but
It's great stuff, Jeff.
yeah, it's important about not having only one way of looking at the world.
Right.
The importance of having, you know, analytically stories, all different types of learning integrated, so that we're not necessarily like categorizing people unjustly. So.
Yeah. And you see it in a nutshell in the confusion between, here's Aristotle describing how the class system should work, and it should work for the good of the whole of all the Greeks, right? The goal is anthropoculture, right? It's to make a healthy culture, to raise people to bring their gifts to the fullest for the benefit of everyone. That's what Aristotle's describing, right? It's for the good. But when we look around among the Greek societies, we see that that's not what it's about. It's about who gets the goodies and who doesn't get the goodies, who has to labor and who doesn't have to labor, and you know, who gets to have nice things and who doesn't get to have nice things. And there's a huge disagreements among the Greek city-states about how close should their caste system match the ideal. So the Athenians are proud of the fact that the Persian emperor can't tell who's a slave and who's not when he walks down the street. Everybody's dressed the same, right? The slaves have a lot of the same things that everybody else has. So they're sort of hard to distinguish. But you wouldn't have said that if you'd walked down the streets of Sparta, right? Because in Sparta, the Spartans were obsessed with, you know, the slaves have to be our inferiors, right down to, from part one of the rites of passage is to go kill some of them. You know, it's like, yes, I killed some slaves. I'm a man. I'm a free man. It's like, you know who didn't find themselves on the end of a sword, randomly wake up some night being slaughtered just so somebody could feel like a man? The upper class. You know, there's an enormous difference in quality of life between the upper class and the lower class among the Spartans. And that's among the reasons why the Spartans had a lot of slave revolts. You know, they held as many slaves as they possibly could, and they treated them like crap. And that doesn't match the justification for the slave society. And what people are doing is taking the class system and using it to please themselves, rather than using it for the good of of all the Greeks, which would include the slaves. So when you see these arguments about the reason that a slave needs a master is because the slave isn't fit to govern himself, and he needs somebody to govern him to keep him from hurting himself and to give him the best possible life. If you look at Athens, you'd scratch your head and go, well, maybe it's uncomfortable, but maybe. But then you look at Sparta, you're like, no, that's obviously not why this class system exists. So again, there's this whole thing of what do you mean by slave? What are we talking about here? And it's an interesting phenomenon that applies to us in the modern world every bit as strongly. The ease with which people accidentally shift back and forth between one set of justifications and another. In mid-conversation, somebody can be saying, the reason we have the actual class system we have is for the purposes of the ideal class system that we don't have. And they'll say that sentence without ever referring to the fact that one of them is the real one and one of them is the aspirational one. And thus their brain is hopping between different contexts in order to rationalize something that couldn't be rationalized if they kept those contexts absolutely clear and explicit. There's a gamesmanship, an unconscious gamesmanship that we all play with our categories when we're rationalizing, frankly, unjust situations that work to our benefit. And what you were talking about not looking for simple answers, but looking for the true complexity of the situation and taking it all into account when you're thinking about how to organize societies. That's the trick that we ought to be doing to make a more just society, but that historically we keep falling down on. The Greeks did as much as anybody else, rather conspicuously. Anyway, thanks for bringing that up, Joe. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I don't know. I thought I was going to say to Phil first, aristocrats, I don't think are aristocrats because they know everything or agree on everything or anything, or that any aristocrat particularly cared what other aristocrats thought of them. They were stubbornly individual or independent. I would say it's kind of like one graduate student when I was in school studying philosophy says, well, after these philosophers, after the end of the world, they all get together in some old folks' home for old philosophers. What do you think they talk about? I don't know. He says, well, probably the same things they argued about all their lives. The aristocrats, if they had anything, they had to carry the Aristos, I'll say, so it won't sound so American. Just had the character traits that allowed them to argue persuasively what they thought was right, and to be persuaded when their arguments were defeated. This is what took place on the Pnyx, the hill in Athens, when 6,000 of them got together and spoke. They either persuaded or were persuaded. In fact, we often, I think, forget what a good thing it is to be persuaded, to have had our argument defeated, and to actually change our minds. We don't do that often enough. But that was just for Phil. That we don't talk about the Greek aristos because they were all of one mind or like mind or agreed. The other, they had character, like what Joe talks about. Then they probably lived as if, while being mortal, as if their life, they didn't shape their beliefs for pragmatic concern. They weren't afraid to fight. They weren't afraid to die. you know, anyway. I was actually going to say, before you guys got me all worked up, that we're going to see, I think, I haven't gotten all my reading done, but just very early, some real philosophical issues that Kenneth is raising here at the start of this section. How do we determine what traits are essential and inessential? You know, we just can't, I mean, it seems obvious. Skin color makes no difference. Maybe it does, I don't know. Maybe gender, maybe, I don't know. But we're going to have to think of that. And that's going to come up, I'm pretty sure, again and again. Other traditional arguments are like, and we've seen them already in our discussions, existence and essence. We sort of say existentialism makes so much sense because we exist first. Yes, but in Kenneth's view, I think, as that existing being comes to know itself, there's that, right? What was that? Genothe seaton, you know, the phrase that runs through all of this, it finds it has an essence. It has a character. And that essence, in some sense, has ontological priority, maybe even though it's, you know, that nothing becomes without having an essence. These are and then we're going to talk about, we always talk modern about, is it nature or nurture? And we're going to see here, and we've already seen in just the first paragraph, that it's nature and nurture in some combination, and we'll need to understand that. I'll say phusis and paideia. You have to have a culture capable of rearing aristos, of bringing them to maturity, but phusis has to provide individuals with the character traits or the essence that they can have this done to them. You know, that they can become who they are. And Rick mentions that all the time, especially to Sharon. You know, that you have to be in a culture, an aristos can't exist in some cultures, and it can't. And sort of to tie this up, I'll talk back to Phil and I's favorite subject, the Republic. You see in the Republic all the stuff that Plato does. I mean, the guardians, they don't know who their children are. They have no possessions. They can't form family. They can't, you know, the aristocratic class can't just be nepotism on steroids. Everybody has to say, you know, if my children have the right stuff, even though I might not know it, they could become, they may be one of the aristos ruling this city right now, and I just don't know it. It could be that I know this process of anonymization ensures them a chance, and I can buy in. So how do you buy in? How, I mean, you can kind of think is what are the kinds of things that as Socrates and Glaucon and Adeimantus talked there, did they come up with as being necessary to make an eristic organization of a city acceptable to everyone, that everyone could feel like, yeah, either the ones who are ruling, they deserve it. They did the work. They have the necessary character. And I'm confident in that. So I can go about my plumbing, my making of vases, doing stonework, carving, whatever, and know that it was it's a transparent process, but it also hides a lot because you don't actually know whose children won. But you kind of know, and that's why I sometimes think when they finally you see the whole list, you realize that, well, this is hopeless. You could never get anybody to do this. This is ad absurdum argument against having good rulers. You're just not going to get them, and there's always going to be resentment from the people that aren't ruling because they don't come to rule by a process that even though it's explained to them, and it has to be explained in myth, that Plato writes his own myth, the myth of the metals, to try and see that how everybody could understand how this could work, how gold children can be born to brass parents. Go on. Well, enough. This is going to be a fun chapter. I'll try not to ruin it for you guys.
You're not ruining it for us, Donald. No, you're going to be enriching this discussion a lot because, yeah, this is going to be drawing a lot off of the things you've studied and the things you and Kenneth have talked about together. So I'm really looking forward to it. And it's juicy. I mean, we spent a long time building up to this point where we have this shared vocabulary of ancient terminology and concepts to allow us to wrestle with this thing. So I think I don't know how long section G is going to take to get through, but I think it's going to be really interesting, partially because it's so provocative. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, what I have to say is very simple. I got to start from the fundamentals. This section is called Character and Class. And I think the earliest evolution of class came about as the hunter-gatherers settled down and started to organize themselves into societies. They developed a kind of hierarchical system within the group of people that lived together. And those who were able to show leadership went ahead of the pack. And I think the way I understand it, that's how some of the early political structures evolved. And both class and character is different in almost every single culture. I mean, I was raised in a British type society, and I come to America, and I notice that the class boundaries that I grew up with are not here. In America, if you have money, you're okay. Whereas where I came from, you needed to have education to have a little class, right? So class and character are different. Now, as societies organize themselves, they set the rules for behavior. And that I see as the early evolutions of character, because societies had to be harmonious. And so therefore they had to set certain standards. Now, that is my complete layman interpretation of it, because the little philosophy I've read, I said all the philosophers have their own definition of what an excellent character is, right? And so it kind of dovetails with the sentence here when it says, for the Greeks realize that the human personality and intelligence cannot be taken for granted as being all the same quality and tendency, because it's not. Now, that doesn't sound anywhere near as complex as everybody else, but it's the basics of my understanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. And yeah, that's the critical sentence in the opening paragraph of this section. He's saying the medievals and the moderns at least pretend that the goal is equality, and that equality is either the truth or it's the aspirational goal. But the Greeks said it wasn't. The Greeks said people aren't all the same, and that we are neither identical to each other nor are we the same in all being different from each other. They said people naturally develop into different characterological species. And those different characterological species are fundamentally alien to each other, even though they're working with the same basic biological ingredients, the same faculties of the mind and the same overall genetics and so forth. Nevertheless, people tend to cohere into one of these three mentalities, and the mentalities don't understand each other at all, and they don't sympathize with each other at all. Um, and they do very different things when you give them power. So, to the Greeks are saying, if it is true that we are different from each other, then the question becomes, how do we make a just society? How do we make a society that, as Aristotle says, has kalos? It's the beautiful. What is the right way to do this? And that question is anathema to the medievals and the moderns. The moderns say we're all equal. There is no difference. And if there is, we are going to deny it to each other and pretend that it's not there. It's like you start with the ideology and then you cherry pick the facts to make people conform to the ideology. This is the modern perspective, for all that we praise ourselves for our scientific, advancement. And the medieval perspective is whatever paltry differences there are between human beings, they don't matter when you compare them to the glory of God. God is omniscient. He's omnipresent. He's all good. He's all knowing. He's all powerful. No human being can compare. That we're all equal in being creatures of God, and we're all equal in being finite mortals by comparison with, and finite flawed mortals by comparison with the perfect good of God. And therefore, we're all brothers. Sure, we may divide society into those who fight, those who pray, and those who labor, but that's just a detail. Somebody has to take care of those things, and that's how we organize it. We're all equally liable to be saved or not saved, and we all have, the gift of grace from God that makes us have meaning and worth, and therefore we're all brothers. So it's intrinsic to the medieval and modern perspectives that there cannot be fundamental differences in character between human beings. There must not be. If there are, then the reasonable person theory, which is the basis of juries, right? Enlightened self-interest, which is the basis, the justification for the marketplace, is that everybody knows what their needs are and pursues them, and therefore it makes sense to put us all on a level playing field. I could go on. All of the basic frameworks of modernity don't work if we're in different species, characterologically. We have to all be of the same kind. So the most radical part of Section G is this statement. If, in fact, a close study of human beings shows that we have fundamentally alien characters that fall into different characterological species, then the implications for everything from religion to politics to the economy to everything else, they're profound. And what he's saying here is that the ancient world took that seriously and tried to build societies on that basis, and the medieval and modern worlds don't. If we're looking for that short list of what are the most alien qualities of the ancient worldview, this is number 7, right on the list, Section G. This is the 7th alien quality. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, this is getting complex in a way. Sorry, Sarah, it's complex. I think Donald mentioned something kind of important, the relationship between existence or being and, well, maybe I shouldn't say being sort of prejudice the thing, existence and essence. And in a way, I kind of believe in both, but I think of essence as a kind of aspiration of the invisible in which I want to find myself in the future. In other words, I come unto my essence. I am in a state of existence. And so in some sense, it's important because coming to makes things more dynamic. In other words, we're not there yet, or at least I'm not there yet. Maybe you are. Maybe you guys are perfect. I'm not. And that's I think the thing about existence is you have to accept your finitude, because if you don't accept your finitude, then in a sense you're excluded, or else you can come unto it, at least to something a little bit more perfect than you are. So a dynamic system allows you to evolve and emerge, the essence to emerge and unfold, like I guess the essence of a seed, and it's meant to become a flower. I mean, it's like, so therefore you emerge. And I think that dynamism makes it, in the sense that essence is not necessarily right there, but something that you come unto. Now, of course, if you take the Augustine's point of view, by the way, I like Augustine, even though I kind of become more and more disagree with him, is that Augustine at least claimed that he knew God, and God knows my essence already. So all I have to do is let God shine upon my mind, and I will come to know myself, my true essence of what it is. I like that idea, but I don't actually believe it. You know, uh, I like the fact, I like more the myth that I'm thrown out of the Garden of Eden, and now I'm sort of like on my own in the world. I'm thrown into the world, you could say. God threw me out of Garden of Eden. I'm in the world. I have to find out what I can based on like a half brain that I have, because I don't have the other half. And so I have to struggle for it. So I kind of think last night I was in a very, very interesting meeting. I went to it because it sounded very interesting. It was the new biology. It was this guy was talking. The part I disagree with him, I didn't disagree with him, but I have suspicions. He approached it from an engineering point of view, but he was very open, so I'm not criticizing what he said. And he find that, even the lowliest of living organism seem to have a purpose. Maybe they don't have a mind, but they have a purpose. They seem to know what's going on, because like if you take you separate cells or whatever, they will come back to become what they are already. So there's something already structured within them that they will become whatever they are. And in some sense, the larger organism that sort of, you could say, control them, they don't really control them. It's more like you sort of influence them in a way to lead them in a way to become whatever they will become, rather than dictatorial, like you will be this. And he says on various level, they seem to have a propensity to become what they are meant to be, structurally speaking. But there seems to be like also a duality. They seem to also have some sense of what the whole being is. In other words, the blood vessel cells will do whatever they do, not only because that is what they meant to be done, but they also know that that's necessary for the bigger system to be. So when this guy was describing this, I was saying, and I mentioned, I said, that sounds an awful lot like a bureaucratic system. Like each attendant in a bureaucracy know what they do. They're doing their job. But the problem is that we have a mechanical model, and we also have a problem of identity, because a person who's like, let's say, a clerk, he or she is also a person, like, and so he's not good. His whole life is not just like clerking, and so there's a difference between himself and the larger being, which is the society. And I think part of the problem and I would maybe criticize myself as part of that too, but we're all under that sway, is that perhaps we don't have enough of this sort of relationship where the self is also part of a larger self, that we understand this larger thing. And I think the Greeks understood that better than we did, because they understand the community as part of the living whole. And whereas we tend to say, hey, like, yeah, do that for me, that's fine, thanks for building the road, by the way. but I'm me, I'm going to do what the hell I want. And I think that part almost make me seem, and I said that, almost make me seem like these microorganisms seem to be wiser than I am. Because they don't say, fuck you, I'm going to go wherever I want. I'm going to do my job as it should be, because I'm also concerned about the whole being self. And how do they come to know what their limits are? And we don't seem to know what our limits are, partly because we see ourselves, and I see myself as evolving into me, and and so it's just very interesting. If that's the case, it almost seems like, and I won't count the rock does that. Maybe some people will, but it almost seems like all living organism, the great separation is they seem to have a built-in destiny, that they know what they're supposed to be, and they evolve in the more complex systems in some sense. And and why haven't we become an ant colony? You know what I mean? It's like, because the ant colony is almost halfway in between, because each individual ant is also ant, but they really worship the colony. I mean, or at least the queen. I mean, they will fight to the death. The whole colony will fight to the death if you screw around with the queen. So that's interesting. I'm not sure if I would do that. I believe enough in the community, but I'm not sure. Certainly, if there was 1,000 of me, I'm sure one of the 1,001 is not for me. Thank you. I think I'm going to retreat to the desert island. So I wonder whether that was the problem from the Garden of Eden to begin with, is that when we ate the apple, we suddenly realized, hey, I'm me. I'm naked, and therefore, like, and so that's God said, get the hell out of here, man. You know, I remember I tell the story about the singer that's in the choir, and she was singing as a soloist. The choir director finally said, you're a very talented musician. Maybe you should become a soloist, because you don't seem to fit with the choir, you know, singing together, And so he wasn't downgrading her. In fact, she was praising her. You need to go to something, you could say maybe higher, but in some sense, you're not in the system, because you're not doing your singing that somehow harmonize with a greater unity. And I think that's a difficult thing for us as human beings to understand. Where does myself end, and where does myself begin in another dimension? And I think that's a difficult thing for each one of us do, because we all know that we take care of our own business, right? And it somehow is like all the system is there for us, rather than that we're also for the system itself as well. So that's why I got to say, so it's a very complex situation about existence and essence. Where does the essence lie? Where does my essence actually lie?
Yeah.
It's a hard thing. I think we all need to learn that lesson, that at least it lies at least partially in relationship to others. That's my feeling. All right, that's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Stephen, what's on your mind?
Oh yes, I shouldn't forget the big point in the Christian controversy, since we're on the subject of slavery now. The the Roman Empire nominally became Christian with the ascension of Constantine, but it really took about a century before more or less the outer aspects of the pagan society had been swept away, and we could say, well, this is truly a Christian culture by our way of thinking. And it was at the latter point that that question arose. And so we had the controversy between Augustine and Pelagius. Now, Pelagius, well, of course, Christianity had that problem that every person, even if it's a drunk lying in the street, even if it's a slave, they all have a soul. They all have a value. They all count. This is something I think even Nietzsche pointed out about Christian religion, of course, is that nobody's a nothing. They all have a value as far as God is concerned. Now, Pelagius was of the view that the person isn't fixed really in their position in life. They can progress. You could be somebody very low down on the social scale, and you can rise to a higher social scale. But then along comes Augustine, and Augustine becomes a magnificent apologist for an empire that's built on slavery, because God in his infinite wisdom made you what you were to fit in the world to what you're born to. But don't worry, Augustine's saying, if your master mistreats you, he'll be punished in the other world. And you'll have a nice seat in heaven. If you're a good slave, don't worry, you do your job and you'll get up to heaven. And of course, who won? Well, the guy that pleased the authorities, Augustine, even though, of course, we have to respect he's one of the great thinkers of history. He established, built on that doctrine of the predestination of the soul. That, God created you as what you were. And if you are a slave, you were created to be a slave. There's a great contradiction to Pelagius, who lost out and his doctrine became the heresy. I just thought I'd bring that up in view of what we're talking about at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, we're gonna have a lot to say about Augustine and Pelagius when we get into the medieval section. There are a lot of these moments where one belief system wins out over another for one set of reasons, but afterwards it's explained a completely different way. What did Pelagius get wrong? What was the Pelagian heresy? It's never explained as it was inconvenient for power. It was never, nobody ever talks about it that way. We sort of learn how to find some other way to rationalize after the fact. And of such compromises, this is how the arc of the medieval era goes. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Really quickly, just to kind of address with something that Donald said. Actually, it was the trigger. It's the the idea of essence, and then how that is complex. But I think part of this is in understanding the essential nature of what it means to have actually even character. What are some of the essential components? And I think one of those essential components is obviously knowing ourselves and challenging our preconceived notions of the world. And the reason that is so important is because then you can challenge the preconceived notions that there's this, these structures in place that categorize people based off of unjust things like age, whatever it may be, race, whatever. And in that process that you can kind of understand self better, then you can kind of see yourself as part of something where you're connected to everybody else. And so that you start to see the inherent worth in each individual, that it's a process that comes through, that you have to go through internally. What Stephen was talking about was the way it comes externally when he was talking about religion, in the sense that everybody has a role. That's coming external. That doesn't come from the internal. And there's that distinction that's very important to make in one's personal journey. Because one is done out of obedience, and then the other one's done out of an epiphany, a divine unveiling, if you will. And those are two different ways to kind of come to that conclusion of that everybody has an inherent worth. But more importantly, I think that the question that needs to also be asked in this process is, what does it mean to make progress? Now, progress how? You can make progress becoming, economically. Is that how we're defining progress? I mean, that's my question. Unpacking everything here is fundamentally, we need to define what progress really is. And that's knowing yourself and challenging your preconceived notions. And Kenneth talks about that very clearly. And the ability to do that is essential when you're talking about character. So it's another question to be on the table. What when you come to this realization and understanding yourself, and you look internally, what is it then that you determine what is the most important thing to have progress? What are these? And so anyway, that's something that I would like to throw on the table, as well as the questions that Donald put on. But I don't think it's necessarily relative. It's not, just as the point I was making earlier, I don't think it's one-dimensional. It's it's very complex. And Kenneth makes that clear. So.
Thank you, Joseph. Yeah, this is that issue that fundamentally the Greeks are arguing that society should be organized according to character, but the problem is that, as Heraclitus says, "Phusis cryptus thae philae," your character, nature loves to hide. Your character, and until today, I always interpreted that as nature loves to hide, that the principles behind things are hidden underneath the surfaces. And it wasn't until this very moment that I realized that because he talks about the nature around us and within us, because he uses that amphibious ontology, for what it means to be a human being, he is equally saying the nature, our individual nature, also loves to hide. And this is the challenge for us in knowing ourselves, like you're talking about. And it's also the challenge in trying to make a good society according to the Greek concept of a good society. Because if you're supposed to organize it according to character, but you can't tell what anybody's character is, not even your own, you have a problem. You know, they have that saying, don't count a man happy until the last day of his life, until he's died, because you don't know how his story turns out until it's over. And someone can completely ruin in the last year of their life everything they stood for, in some horrific development that naturally comes from within their character, but that we didn't see until that point in their development. And that's inconvenient because that argues that we can only make a just society of the dead. After they're dead, we can organize them according to their character, which has exposed itself over the course of their life. But living people are still full of the seeds of the future when they're hidden from us. So we're not sure where they're supposed to be placed within society. And this struggle to figure out how character and class should be related to each other. I mean, this is all going to come out of section G here. And I will call on Phil, but then I'm going to the text after that. So go ahead, Phil. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. You're on mute, Phil. I may have accidentally muted you instead of
Okay. I just want to say something brief about that will supplement what Joseph said about, the complex self in a sense. But this is, I guess, in some ways, a self-criticism, but it also as a criticism of society and a realization of this whole episode. When I was in college, I was very poor, as I said, our family never had a car. So the only way to get home sometimes when I want to go home, I have to hitchhike. So I was hitchhiking, because I went across the bay from Berkeley to San Francisco. I'm hitchhiking down the peninsula, and this guy in a kind of truck picked me up, and it was something really funny happened. I thought it was funny, but I thought it was also a kind of insight that allowed me to see it. And this guy was driving along, and he started pointing out, you see that? You see that? And I'm looking, I didn't quite see it. And then I saw that was like, that maybe a flaw in the highway that he put some asphalt over, and he did the thing. He fixed that. He said, I did that. Okay. And so we drive down the way. See that? See that? I did that, And he was trying very hard to be proud of himself. And I actually like that, but I was thinking, what is he proud of? I mean, it just seems so idiotic, right? But on the other hand, I begin to realize that, well, not only was I a bit maybe too elitist, but I realized that was not my fault. The class structure had made it so something of that type of work we don't even allow people to really be proud of. And he was able to be proud of what he did. And that was a good thing. And so there's something wrong with our structure in society that somehow makes it difficult for us to be proud of our craftsmanship, of what we do. And that has something to do with the oppressive nature of capital, You work in a factory. I guess you could say, well, I helped make that car. Well, which part did you do? Well, I put that screw in the in the fender, you see. You're thinking like, oh my God, okay. And so we have to somehow figure out a way that everybody, no matter what level they're in, have a right to be proud, because that's part of being a self in that sense, in some sense. And that's part of the flaw of society, because that's the reason why you can't be part of a society that's outside yourself, because you can't even be proud of yourself, let alone be proud of your culture and civilization. And so that was a very, very interesting. It was one of those sort of like, fluke. that happened to arrive with that guy, and what's a fluke that he was so proud of some quote idiotic thing that I'm thinking, because I guess I was thinking about artists like, oh, no, come on. I of course didn't say, come on, guy, like what the hell is that? I, I realized that there was nothing wrong with him. There was something wrong with a social structure. So that's interesting. That complements what you said.
Yeah, that's really
So I
interesting.
wanted to say that, Joseph.
Thank you, Phil. All right, let's go to the text. So section G, he starts out really setting up what Sharon quoted at the beginning. When he says the Greeks' most prodigious contribution to civilization may be the very insight that medieval and modern world orders have so scrupulously eradicated or buried. And then that sets up the sentence that she quoted earlier. For the Greeks realized that human personality and intelligence cannot be taken for granted as being all of the same quality and tendency. We can't just ideologically, from the outset, say that it is not an open question whether we're all the same or whether we're all different or whether we fall into classes naturally, characterologically. That's something that should be investigated scientifically, said the Greeks. And they believed that they had. And they believed that the conclusion that they'd reached is that there were these three character types, you could say, or three mentalities that result from habits of usage of the fundamental faculties. And I struggled for a while to figure out why was it that I had been so resistant to this part of Kenneth's philosophy early on. And I really just had an attachment to the idea of equality equals good. It wasn't until later that I came to understand what was bound up in that for me. This idea that people don't deserve to be treated with respect unless they're your equals was an unstated assumption built into the idealization of equality as good, right? People deserve to be treated well because there are equals is actually an immoral position. Because what if people are different from you? Does that mean they now deserve to be oppressed? I mean, what are we saying here? Why is equality a precondition for treating people well? Why can't people deserve respect even if they're different from each other? And you really see some of this in the relationship between adults and children. We say that we abolished slavery, but of course, no child is allowed to vote. So they're political slaves at least. And we take the vote away from felons in many states. And many of those felonies are questionable at best, drug convictions, for example, that may not have anything to do with their ability to be a member of society. That when we start treating the franchise as a privilege rather than a necessity, there's ideology bound up with that, and it's all sort of associated with this question of who deserves to be treated with respect. And this is ultimately, I came to understand that the danger I saw in Kenneth's arguing that the Greeks might be right, that there are different species of people characterologically. The danger is not the idea itself, but rather how cruelly we would treat people. We would use that as a basis for cruel treatment. Of course we would. We use everything else, including completely irrelevant criteria, as a basis to dominate other people who don't deserve to be treated poorly. So of course we would use this too. Well, of course we would. But that has nothing to do with the idea itself, because if anything, the idea itself may actually be associated with a morally higher position, which is that people should be allowed to be different from each other and still not mistreated. Right? That's a higher moral position than we assert that everybody is the same and therefore they deserve to be treated well. The latter position, which is the modernist position, is actually a descendant of the genocidal position of the medieval epoch, which said we're all brothers under Christ, but if we're not under Christ, then we're not all brothers, and therefore we can commit genocide and exterminate all other religions. There must only be medieval Christianity and nothing else, was the position for 1,000 years in Europe, right? And so there's a way in which there are these unexamined, and Kenneth talks about this elsewhere, there are these unexamined fragments of older epochs, undigested within the modern epoch, that we have organized ourselves around without understanding that these are old ideas and unexamined ideas, and they might not bear scrutiny. And it's part of why it's so radical to look at this ancient perspective, because the ancient perspective just directly confronts this question. You know, is genocide justifiable if people are different from you? Shouldn't you maybe treat people with respect regardless? The Greeks didn't run around trying to exterminate other religions. They would fight for plenty of reasons, but not in order to create a homogenous world. The idea that justice and peace and respect can only flow from homogeneity is not an ancient idea. It's a medieval and modern idea. We're the ones that are their moral inferiors on this particular element. And again, I'm not a Hellenophile. There are plenty of places in which I'm appalled by ancient behavior, but part of being able to see with eyes unclouded by, you know, modernist filters requires us to be able to see where people who are our inferiors in some ways are simultaneously our superiors in other ways. And I got used to this because of the medical work, right? I mean, trying to organize everything into a linear hierarchy of everybody is better or worse than everybody else. You just have to line them up and assign them a number and say who's at the top and who's at the bottom and where does everybody fit on the scale. That's stupid. It's just deeply, you can't just say all pharmacists are better than all lab techs, and, you know, dietitians, maybe they're lower, and maybe surgeons are at the top, right? I mean, these kinds of pecking orders make no sense. A hospital in which you remove all the pharmacists because they're inferior is a hospital that now can't prescribe any drugs to anybody. You know, it's like this idea of, you know, rigid, simple linear sequences of evaluation is like a child's mind, a very childish child's mind trying to make sense of a very complex thing. What Joe's been talking about, in, you know, when he's added his comments, has really underscored the way in which any one of these issues to be dealt with realistically and justly requires us to put away these little child toys approaches to understanding the world and being able to deal with the actual complexity of the situation. So there's something just like ancient polytheism is really interesting from a religious perspective. The idea that you don't get to pick and choose what has authority over you, that you have to search it out. And there may be a lot of things that have authority over you. That's interesting, right? That requires a complex theology and a complex philosophy to go with it. In the same way, the idea that there are diversity of human beings, including different characterological species, and people have different gifts, some for art, some for music, you know, some for farming. I mean, there's a variety, right? And that we need all of them. All of that, none of that exists so that we can say, haha, I'm better than you. It exists so that, you know, there are people who are good at the things that we need to, you know, have done. This is more sophisticated than the modern perspective ethically. This is a more sophisticated position. He goes on, such a preconception or faith in uniformity is an a priori bias, radically contrary to the diversity typical of all things natural, as Aristotle already grasped. Right? I mean, we look at trees and no two of them are the same. And in fact, we look at things and we see that they divide out into completely different species. Even things that superficially resemble each other may turn out to be fundamentally different underneath the hood, if you will. I mean, everywhere we see this diversity. It's the idea of claiming that Homo sapiens is homogenous and ergo deserves to be treated with respect it's berserk, right? It's contranatural. To conceive of human personality not as divinely derived spirit, the medieval perspective, or as self-originated rational will, the modern perspective, but as primally natural psyche, is to comprehend that the essence of what we are is differential, multiplex, variable, and perspectively polyglot. So I think that this sort of diversity-oriented interpretation of Homo sapiens goes hand in hand with the diversity-oriented approach to their theology, and that you can see how both of them derive from looking at nature and finding diversity in nature, and finding that nature is not a constant struggle to eliminate all but one thing. It's not about there can only be one species and that species can't win unless it destroys all other species so that it's the only one left. That's contranatural. We don't see any evidence of that as being a viable strategy for creating an ecosystem. And instead, it's that there need to be a lot of different kinds of things. So he's basically, in this paragraph, he's tying us all the way back to section A, where he's talking about nature itself, right? Physis as becoming and as intrinsic truth, and showing that just like it was the source for so many other things we've talked about in chapter 4, that's the source for their idea that people are diverse as well, because that's how nature naturally expresses itself. All right, let's go to questions, comments, and concerns. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, it's a question here about what's been expressed at the moment here about our tendency to categorize things, which I'm bringing up the philosopher Herder, who was, contemporary of Goethe's and Kant's. Now, Herder was, people would say on one level he was a bit of a fool, but he did raise a lot of important questions. And he was a reactionary to the Enlightenment. And the point he was making, those specific points, that the Enlightenment, this whole new world that they're bringing in from the sort of the late 17th century, was one that categorized nature and everything. And we've got the categories now. Yeah, see. And he was pointing out that they're operating from empty categories. And that's the danger. He was pointing out the troubles with generalization, that it's I thought this was exclusive to Goethe until recently, and now I'm realizing that Herder preceded Goethe on these arguments. And there must have been a lot of people who noticed a transition of society that was being overcome by this beautiful enlightenment where everything was being categorized and generalized. And so Herder would, if you look up something on YouTube, Herder's complaining about this, that yes, it's this danger of generalization, that everything really is asymmetrical. And now we've got a philosophy which is trying to squeeze everything into a pigeonhole. Well, it's a bit like, what's his name, Procrastes. Here's another happy customer. I'll make you fit my bed. And this, of course, is greatly overlooked by the Enlightenment. They don't want to talk about the counter-revolutionaries, the reactionaries, the romantics, as they were called, who were coming up with the warning. Of course, the existentialists, Nietzsche and all that, were a continuation in a different way of the romantic reaction to the Enlightenment. And so you look at these passages, and this question is coming up very strongly, that the Enlightenment started looking at the world as if it's uniform. And the culture preceding the Enlightenment, the culture which was still very much there in the 16th and 17th centuries, still had that ancient flavour of saying, yes, bring me something. Yes, that's a unique acorn lying under the oak tree. Yes, it had. Yes, we can't just classify it. It's not exactly the same as everything else. And this was Herder's other complaint. And this comes up in Nietzsche, where Nietzsche is complaining that we're cutting ourselves off from the vitality of life. And yet Herder's making this very much complaint in these empty categories, that we're we're taking away the thing that motivates us, that makes us want to live.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll stick his name up. I assume you have heard of her, haven't you?
Type his name. I might not have
I'll put
pronounced.
something in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to do that because I don't recognize it by sound, but maybe if I see the name, I'll go, oh, that guy. Yeah, sure. Or maybe I'll go, whoa, someone new. So thanks for bringing him up. Meanwhile, Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I even forgot specifically what he said, but it engendered in me like have civilization has, especially modernity, trapped us into a no exit. What I mean in this sense is that we have underscored efficiency so much that we have either underplay or ignore exploitation. And I sort of understand by that contrast, the contrast between Hegel and Marx now in a better light, in a different light. I mean, Hegel was the history of the evolution of spirit, of culture, of spirit. And Marx sort of said, no, 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 no. It's the stuff, it's the matter, right? And he has a good argument because, well, if you go back to the Greeks, or go back to, well, I shouldn't say go back to all cultures, but a lot of cultures, slavery was a good thing in one respect. It made for a lot of efficiency. So you could develop the spirit of civilization, right? So without slavery, there wouldn't be Hegel because we would still be back in the old ages or whatever. So I wonder whether that's gotten to a point, particularly with Adam Smith, with capital. And by the way, I'm not slamming capital altogether, but in some sense, the invisible hand, I wonder if the invisible hand is not the hand of efficiency at ignoring that how you get there is oppression, whether that's through colonialism, whether that's through, trampling on underclasses and whatsoever, whether that's reducing the fact that, well, like I said, the guy who laid the asphalt on the thing, he's suppressed, so he could not express his true humanity. He's reduced to say, look at that, I did that. It's like, so in some sense, have we trapped ourselves? Because right now we have 8 billion people on the planet. Can we go back to an arts and craft tradition without, well, let's say 6 million people dying, 6 billion people dying? Have we gone to a point of no exit? I mean, should we have, let's say, certainly by the Adam Smith time, realize that, well, wait a minute, we have to think about the human spirit also. Now, maybe at the day of Adam Smith, it hasn't quite emerged to the degree that it seems apparent. But on the other hand, efficiency has allowed us to have 8 billion people. I mean, are you going to tell 6 billion of those people, you don't deserve to live? You don't even deserve to be a slave. I mean, like, have we arrived at no exit? Should we have gotten off the boat, 3,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago? Would we be happy? I don't know. I just don't know. It's like, not only that, I've gotten to a point like, I don't know if I could go back to live in a cottage, like without my without my internet and being a, I mean, so I'm also trapped in this sort of structure that I'm in also, because these are the things, part of these things are things I desire. So, no, am I gonna go now, go flog myself because I am guilty because I had desired these things, which I might not have desired if I wasn't thrown into this situation to begin with. So maybe at Plato's time, we wouldn't have been in this trap. There was different traps, so maybe there were still exits. I kind of think there's no exit now without a lot of people dying, you know? And and I've been listening to this guy, Peter Zion. He says globalization was he saw it as a good thing. I'm not so sure, but he said now with the deglobalization, it's going to be less efficient. Fertilizers, people can't transport it, and so much of agriculture depend on fertilizers because most places are not productive, and there's going to be a lot of people that's going to be very hungry and starve to death soon. So I believe he's right, and it's like, am I supposed to, how do I ignore that? I mean, I could say, well, don't shout in my ears about that, but in some sense, you have to at least once in a while, oh God, like there's hunger. There's hunger right now, so are we left with no exit? Could we even afford to be compassionate? There's so many people dying. I mean, how many people can I feel sorry for? I mean, like, this is where we are. I mean, it's like, what could I say? No exit. That play may be a correct one.
So I'm not going to try to answer that question right now. I'm gonna take us back 2,500 years,
Okay.
and look at the Greeks some more. But part of the reason why I'm going to evade that is modernity. We're not at end stage modernity. I think when we get to end stage modernity, we'll see alternatives. We're in late stage modernity, and in late stage modernity, our ideology is stronger than it's ever been. It's very hard for us to think outside of the ideology that has us. And the ideology says all of history is a great linear march of progress that leads to this moment. And so the only alternatives to this are something more primitive. That's it. Those are your choices. Either us, the pinnacle of being advanced, or something worse. And within that, it takes all of the complexities of history and boils it down to a line, a one dimension, and then boils the line down to 0 dimensions, 2 points, either what we have now or less, right? So which do you want? Do you want less or do you want this? And that's the triumph of the ideology. As Kierkegaard writes about this, he calls it delusion, but he writes about this extensively. He says, you know that the delusion has you when you can't find a way out. If you search and search and there doesn't seem to be any alternative, that is the fingerprints of an ideology in action. That's that a complex world with an infinite number of choices suddenly seems like a world with no choices. And it's the unsuccessful ideologies that allow you to see the alternatives, because then they're not traps, and so they don't grow over time, right? To grow over time, it has to be a trap such that once you wander into it, you can't find your way out. It has to be a labyrinth. And if it is a labyrinth, then it will grow. And the better a labyrinth it is, the more it'll grow, and the more it will sort of come to dominate the world. If it is a realistic perspective on life that shows you that there's lots of options, then among those options is to leave that weak ideology and enter a stronger one you can't get out of. And so, in the same way that bad money drives out good, good, strong ideologies drive out weak ones, which is to say, more reality challenged worldviews drive out more reality-based worldviews. And they do it because once you're in them, you can't leave. You don't see an alternative. That's where we all are in late stage modernity. It doesn't seem to be a choice. It's not until you actually dig into the concrete details of the world that you see how much of what we believe to be true about ourselves is actually false. Are we the most efficient ever? No, we're not the most efficient ever. We have unbelievable scales of waste. I mean, the amount of food we throw away every year in order to prevent giving it to hungry people, right? Because if there aren't hungry people, there's not a motivation to raise prices on food. I mean, we have these perverse incentives, right? We have so many empty houses, and we have homeless people And we can't put the two together. Is this the pinnacle of efficiency? Well, it depends on what you're talking about being efficient about. Are you being efficient about housing people, or are you being efficient about extracting money from the housing market? So we're very efficient at getting as much money as possible from housing being turned into a market, but we're not efficient at all about putting people into houses. And that's why we have so many houses that stand empty, and well, there's people sleeping on the street. And what you find is that in case after case, all the fundamentals of life, that's how we are. Efficiency isn't this universal thing. It's trade-offs, like in computer science. If I want my program to run faster, I might need to make it take up more space. I may need to add an index to my database to make it faster to look things up. But if I do that, then it's less efficient on space in order to be more efficient on speed. But somehow when we get into discussions of modernity from within the modern perspective, efficiency stops being a trade-off and becomes this universal truth. And somehow all forms of efficiency are the same form of efficiency. So we talk about whether modernity is efficient or is not efficient, and we don't talk about what is it efficient at, and in order to achieve that efficiency, what is it inefficient at? We stop talking about the multidimensional situation. It affects all of us, literally. I mean, and it's because it's the way the newspaper articles are written, it's the way the political speeches work, it's the way the stories go in Hollywood. Everything is saturated with this concept of the abstractions being simple, universal, kind of monotheistic truths, kind of post-medieval monotheism, right? We'll get into this. But the Greeks certainly didn't see it that way. They thought there were a variety of choices. They didn't even run their different city-states the same way, and still thought of themselves as Greeks, which shows that it's possible to be a culture that has extreme levels of diversity within it and yet simultaneously considers itself a whole, which is something we don't entirely believe as post-medieval moderns. We struggle with whether that's possible or not. It's part of why it's radical to study the ancients. James, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about these three characters, right? Of people. Does that mean that certain groups, certain classes, certain specific a number of these people in a population that are divided into these three groups, most of them will be slaves of the system, and so in order for the system to operate, in a capitalist system or any kind of system, you have to have people who need to work. And so what better than to certain groups of people that are enslaved to their own desires, to make a living, and so they're ultimately enslaved to this need to fulfill their necessities, right?
The douloi, right? You're talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah. So what happens when our economy becomes, technology becomes so efficient that human labor could be done away with, or diminished quite a bit with AI and self-automated technologies. So I mean, there's already a movement towards that, right? You have a guaranteed income for people who are in the future who can't find work, or there's not enough work for them to do in order to make a living. So
it's interesting.
Does that fit into your Ken Smith's philosophy?
I mean, right? It's interesting stuff that you're asking, and it's always full of surprises. When people invented television, they thought it would be a revolution in education, how everybody would be educated. And it wasn't long before we were saying the opposite was happening, that instead of getting educated, people were watching entertaining shows that were pretty dumb. And the dumb ones seemed to do really well. And, it's frustrating. They called it the boob tube. They called it the great glass teeth. They called it any number of things to try to reflect this idea that it was somehow an enormous disappointment. We had this technophiliac projection about what it would do, and we got the inverse. Now, it's not that there aren't intelligent TV programs. There are, but rather that they didn't come to dominate television. I over the weekend I watched this video. You can Google, you can go to YouTube and search for it. It's Leonard Bernstein, and he's giving a talk. Harvard, it's a Harvard lecture. He did a whole series of Harvard lectures. I think called The Unanswered Question, and this one was number 3 in the series. And he's talking about Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, and it culminates with him conducting a performance, the Boston Symphony Orchestra doing the Sixth Symphony. But that's only the end of it. You know, it's 2.5 hours long. The symphony itself is only like 40 minutes. And all the stuff leading up to it is him talking about music theory. What is a symphony? What is Beethoven doing in this symphony? And, you know, this was on television. And the level of discourse and the level of vocabulary and the level of education is shocking. You don't see anything like that ever. I mean, even educational TV today is dumbed way, way down from the level that he just naturally assumed his audience would understand in the 60s and 70s. In fact, he assumed that if they didn't know a word, they wouldn't feel insulted and intimidated, but that they could accept learning new words and that would be okay. You didn't have to hide from people that there were things they didn't know. And so he's introducing all this new terminology and explaining it. He's using Beethoven's Sixth Symphony to say, look what he's done here with tempo. Look what he's done here with the scale. And this is the tonic. This is the dominant. This is the subdominant. Look
We
how
have his name in the chat.
Say that again.
Oh, this guy's name in the chat.
Leonard Bernstein. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's a big
Good old
name.
Lenny. I'll type it into the chat. Leonard Bernstein, Harvard Lecture 3, The Unanswered Question, Beethoven Symphony number 6. It's a really entertaining lecture, but it's at a level of discourse we don't see anymore. And I was having a discussion with my friend Jerry from Eugene a year ago, in which he was talking about how Playboy, of all things, Hugh Hefner used to fund a Playboy hour on television in the 60s. And, you know, everybody has images of, you know, women scantily clad in bunny costumes running around. But no, it was like he'd have Gore Vidal and William Buckley, you know, have a debate about politics. And they'd be talking not at the level of least common denominator, but at the level of their college education, right? Again, with each other about the issues of the day. I remember as a child, that war criminal, Henry Kissinger, he used to do there was a thing that would come on television in the early morning, which was him giving lectures about politics and foreign policy. And the level of discussion in those things too was, again, it was a grown-up adult vocabulary. You just don't see it anymore. So kind of where am I going with all this is it used to be that we could take nuanced views about our relationship to technology, but now it seems that we're caught in these cycles of alternating between hoping that the technology is going to solve all of our problems with us until it arrives and gets commodified and somehow turns into just another gear in the system, and soon we're frustrated with it. You know what the word for 2023 was? A friend of a friend coined the word enshittification. Enshittification. And he said enshittification is a feature of the modern economy, and it shows up everywhere. Someone brings in something new and it's amazing. And everyone thinks, finally, it has arrived. The thing that we needed has arrived. And everybody flocks to it, full of hopes and dreams about how it's going to fix everything. And at first, it just seems amazing. Like Facebook, when people first started doing it, it's like, I could talk to people all over the world. This is wonderful. And then somehow it's sort of, we don't quite understand what happened, but somehow the focus of the company behind it shifts, and they stop trying to make it as good as possible to attract more people. And they start trying to make it as good as possible to advertisers to whom they sell those people, to whom they sell the access. And Facebook starts to get more frustrating for us, but for the businesses, it becomes more lucrative. They can send their ads to us and target them, you know, based on our interests and what we posted. And then eventually, as they keep tinkering with the system, it stops working either for the users or for the people the users are being sold to, and it just becomes crap, like what happened with the meltdown of Twitter last year, where, you know, you had to pay $8 in order to get a green check to say, yes, I'm not lying, I really am that person. You know, suddenly it became a pay service that was really frustrating to use rather than this free thing for everybody to express their thoughts with. And what he was pointing out is he coined this phrase because he says this isn't specific to the digital age. It happens with every single piece of technology. If you watch Hollywood films of the 1950s and 60s, and you look at the quality of air travel on Pan Am, what was your life like when you went to go get on a plane? I mean, they fed you and they pampered you to the best of their ability. Now you're crammed in like cattle, and half the airlines you have to pay extra if you want any food at all. I mean, it's like there is this enshittification that's happened. Now that they've got you as a captive audience, they screw you over. So I bring this up because with the issue of AI and robots, the dream was we could have moral slavery. This was the dream, right? Robots can't feel pain. So it's okay to exploit them, and they'll do all the work that people don't want to do. And that will free human beings up to do art and philosophy and, anything that nourishes our soul and helps us to become a whole human being. But what happened last year? Suddenly AI is being used to do art. So human beings won't have to do art anymore. We are freed up in order to dig ditches. Isn't that great? Wasn't that the dream of robots and AI, that we wouldn't have to have philosophy or political discourse or art? We could leave that to our robot overlords, and we would all be free to scrabble with manual labor. Somehow, AI got enshittified. You can see why this became the word of 2023. So that rather than freeing us for our dreams, it freed us from our dreams, leaving us full time to face the worst parts of the modern world. So, when it comes to efficiency and what technology is gonna do for us, even though I work in technology and have for 40 years, I'm no technophile. I understand the way that technological advances can very quickly be turned around against us in order to make life much less worth living instead of more worth living. And that the variable here isn't the introduction of the new technology or new efficiency. The question is, what is it used to accomplish? Efficient at what? Is it efficient at not having to pay artists, freeing up all that money to save off to the Cayman Islands? Right? Because that was never the dream, but that's actually what's being delivered. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Just thank you for the memory of Leonard Bernstein there. I watched those as a child. They were actually targeted at quite young people. They were his like classical music for young people or something, young people's concerts that he would do and try and explain the music. I'm afraid I don't hear music well enough to understand what he's doing. And after sometime after that, there was actually a similar, maybe copied. I don't know the temporal stuff, but I was living in New Orleans, and the local PBS station there had one of the Marsalis family try and explain progressive jazz the same way, where he had transcribed jazz stuff and current stuff and says, this claims to be progressive. And if it's progressive, there must be something that has changed in it. But he would go back and he would find every element from some earlier musician and say, well, no progress there. What are we talking about? Quite fascinating. These old memories. I remember one. I can't think of what it was, but it was, I think, Edwin Land, the inventor of the Polaroid Land camera. He had a TV thing on color vision because he had to understand color vision in order to do color photographs. And it was like watching, somebody who really knew what they were doing it live, where he had colored lights and intensities and stuff. And you say, oh, well, that's how it works. And here's what the phenomena is. But we don't, you're right. We don't get that, you know, and there's on YouTube, you do see stuff from the BBC that was done and done even more recently of discussions where philosophers, scientists, whatever, will explain things in a way that's both approachable but not conceptually simplified. You know, well, enough.
Yeah, it's shocking, right? And I lived through that transformation in American television. I've been alive. You know, I was born in '66. I was watching television from a pretty young age. I saw the original run of Star Trek. So, you know, and I remember the moon landing. I remember watching it on the black and white television set. So, you know, but nevertheless, despite having lived through it, the process of change is so slow that I forgot how different the discussion used to be compared to today until I was confronted with this earlier, you know. And once I was confronted with it, I was then reminded of all the other discussions I've had over the last decade or two where people have brought up that problem. So what's happened to our level of public discourse, this sinking to the lowest common denominator has become a problem. And there's a reason for it. When an epoch is at its peak, it doesn't have to work relentlessly to justify itself because everything's working. Like you can let people explore anything they want during the peak of your epoch, and they will arrive at the conclusion that we're doing it right. You know, the agriculture seems to be working, the economy seems to be working, art seems to, everybody's like, yeah, you know, and so there's sort of a certain amount of energy that's going into homogenifying minds, but not an overwhelming amount. Because once you've got the basic premises, you're then free to run around and explore the world however you want. And overall, the system can be confident that the system will get stronger through your efforts. But once you become past the peak of your epoch, the epoch is gradually running into more and more cases where its worldview isn't working. Like the United States before and after Vietnam is a very different military strategy, right? Before Vietnam, we sort of thought we could do anything. I mean, and we thought it would be no problem at all to, you know, show these backwoods peasants who's boss, and you know they better do what we tell them because we're a world superpower. And we were shocked to be defeated in Vietnam. We just couldn't believe it. And the result was, if you look before the Vietnam War, there were rules against the Department of Defense buying propaganda time to use against the US directly. That is, they could put out things that were obviously propaganda, but they weren't allowed to, like, you know, majorly invest in Hollywood films and so forth. Or if they did, it was considered, you know, questionable. If it wasn't during wartime, what were they doing? But now it's the norm, right? I mean, if you want to make a film about, you know, that's set in a war or involves the US military in any way, they will cut you off from access unless they can review it and make sure that it makes them look good. And that used to be considered illegal. That was considered immoral, that, you know, the military would have such a strong hand in controlling access to what was said about it. The reason for that shift is partly Vietnam. It's the sense that now the system has to work harder to create a consensus because it's not obviously true that we're right. If we let people go around exploring whatever they want to, they might arrive at conclusions we don't want them to arrive at. So we really have to control more what they have access to. So you see this, you know, in a lot of different places in the modern world. But one of them is, if we're pouring that time into propaganda and ideology, that's time that has to come out of something. There's only 24 hours in a day. That time has to come away from something else. So how about educational programming, right? I mean, it's easier to propagandize people if they're more ignorant. If they don't know as much about the world, you can tell them other countries are whatever you want them to be. And we see that extensively now in a way that we didn't as much when we were younger. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yes, well, I was born in 1960, so I had a little bit more time to catch up with Star Trek and the moon landing. But my recollection of the quality of writing that was in the journals and the newspapers when I was a kid, that I just see stuff being broadcast today which is full of what would have been seen as intellectual mistakes 50 years ago. Most it was brought home to me after my mother died. I found a woman's magazine from 1990. This is just 1990. And I was just blown away at the quality of the articles. You know, fairly long articles, big paragraphs, you know, so well written. And yet so many years later, you pick up a woman's magazine and it's junk. It took that long, but we have to remember that if somebody stood up like a member of Congress or whatever, whether it was absolutely true, and it wasn't, but this was a society which still saw itself as a Christian society. And their attitude to the larger questions of the economy was this, that we needed to provide for people and their families. This wasn't exactly, they didn't have really a welfare attitude, but you needed to work, but you needed to earn enough from your work that you had the fundamentals to live a good Christian life. And why that's important is people had to be preserved from temptation. If people don't have a certain amount of basic, they're tempted to do the wrong thing. And of course, for the Christian attitude, yeah, we can't have that. We can't have a bad society. Now, of course, they didn't have the attitude that the people down the bottom should all be wealthy, but that you should have enough to live the good, wholesome Christian life. And of course, that's changed with the 80s when money became really did well. It had been the God for a long time, been the God for thousands of years, and now it became the main deity.
Greed is good.
You have the literal Gordon Gekko, yes, greed is good. And sort of the claim was going around, oh, this will be good for everybody. But, oh, actually, I argue there's aspects of trickle down that actually do work. There is a lot in trickle down that works. But making wealth and acquisition of wealth a god is what was different. Prior to that, it wasn't necessarily respected as the god. The god was the Christian life. The god was a person adhering to Christian principles, so they make it to heaven. And God's one and not Satan. And we're talking about a bit over 50 years ago, even 50 years ago. Now we're living in a vast transformation, and it is going to cost us, because the attitudes I see flying around now, where you split, for example, your political groups in America, and it will affect the rest of the Anglo-Saxon world, and probably already is, that both groups, and it particularly comes from the left, have the attitude that the other group doesn't deserve to exist, so should be wiped out. This wasn't the view 50 years ago. We are heading down the drain. I think we've lived through centuries of idealism, and there was material progress which supported the idealism. After World War II, there was a material progress in oil production. 1945, world daily oil production was 5 million barrels a day. 1980, it was 65 million barrels a day. There was tremendous growth after the war, and everybody, this was real growth that was coming along. At the moment, we were, how would we say, people began to regard the post-war economy as the new normal. But when that oil growth slowed down, the economy slowed down in the 70s, and people were going, what in the hell's going on? They were partly going to back to the pre-war economy. They didn't understand it. The optimistic outlook, that magnificent post-war growth economy, is the mark by which everything else is measured. And if people don't get that, they're thinking, what in the hell's going on? Where is it? Where's the good stuff? And at present, people think that the idealism will be preserved because just around the corner, there'll be these technologies coming along which will give everybody what they want. And I had a look at all that, and I think not. We're still dependent on the main energy source is the fossil fuels, and I don't see that changing much. But just look at the human machine. If I was to get on a bicycle and ride so far, I would use so much energy. If I put a motor on the push bike and try all the efficiencies, you're not going to get the efficiency anywhere near what the biological machine can do. And I mean, who knows, maybe they will establish these robots of science fiction, but I imagine the creation of such an entity would be such a huge utilization of energy. Look at these other robots made of flesh. They reproduce, they grow up, and they're such efficient robots. But yes, this transition of society from basically a moral concept of what is good, and yeah, the poor people don't expect too much, but you do need to say the basics that preserve you from temptation.
Right.
Well, that's been wiped out.
Right.
That concept has disappeared. This was Nietzsche's warning. Hey, dudes, I'm an atheist just as much as you, but do you realise what's going to happen when you pull the religious rug out from under society? Oh, don't worry, all the atheists were saying, oh, it'll be fantastic. And then, Nietzsche says the problem with them is that they are not just superficial, they're ridiculously superficial. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, there is this issue in which the medieval worldview makes the most sense in the early medieval period when it's standing on the foundations, crumbling foundations, but the foundations of the ancient worldview. It makes most sense as a critique and extension of the ancient worldview. But the farther it gets away, the more successful it is at eliminating the traces of the ancient world, the less sense it makes on its own. It was designed to complement the previous system and rebel against it. And it's the same way with the modern order. And this is amplifying what you're saying, that we don't understand our indebtedness to the medieval world order because we're obsessed with this idea that we're unique and different, and we broke history and finally emerged into a practical utopia. As good as it can get is what we have. And that obsession with ourselves has led us to underestimate the extent to which the modern world made the most sense in the early modern epoch when it was standing on the foundations of the medieval world order. As an extension of it, as a critique of it, it made sense. But the more we've eroded away the medieval foundations, the more we're left with the modern worldview by itself without the rest of the apparatus it depended on. And now it doesn't make sense anymore. And so, to go back to James's question, what is the role of douloi, benalsoi, and aristoi, within within, well, there's a couple ways to ask it that he might have been meaning it. And one way might have been, what is the right today? What is to be done? And another would be, within the framework of modernity, what is the proper usage of these? What does the good life look like if we have these different kinds of people? And is there some way to make a just society out of these differences? And our problem is that as moderns, we're ideologically predisposed to assume that the modern epoch wants to make a just society, but all the evidence is to the contrary. The modern epoch really wants to be maximally profitable for a small number of people. That's what it wants. And it's efficient at that. But at other things, it's just shockingly inefficient. I mean, my wife, she had that sinus surgery in November, and we were hoping that meant she wouldn't be getting bronchitis this winter, but she's got bronchitis again. And she called her doctor and said, but she couldn't reach her doctor because so many doctors have quit the medical profession. So many doctors, nurses, during the pandemic, they just quit. They said, we can't be treated like this. First of all, we're overworked. Second of all, we're catching it more than anybody else because everybody with COVID is bringing it to us. And third of all, people are insulting us and accusing us of being involved in a conspiracy against them, and secretly it's some other disease and we're just claiming it's COVID. So huge numbers of people have left the US medical system. I don't know what it's like in Australia or other places in the world. But the result is, back in the 80s, we used to mock the Soviet Union because you had to stand in line for everything. But now you can't get in to see your primary care provider, at least in Seattle, because there's so few of them. This sinus infection is going to have a good week and a half to get worse and worse and worse before she's even going to get to see her doctor. And last time this happened, she ended up with pneumonia and cracked a rib. That was last March. And her doctor knows that. But her doctor is so overworked and the system is so overburdened and ineffectual that even knowing what's in store, they can't intervene to fix it until it's had a chance to get as bad as possible.
Yeah, this problem's widespread now of technical people within society when they talk about unemployment. Well, there's plenty of unskilled people or
Right.
people that lack the right technical qualifications, but they can't get the technically trained people anymore to the extent that they want. Somewhere's gone wrong. Maybe basically, and it's almost an Ayn Randian element, maybe Atlas is shrugging. Maybe the technical people are saying, well, you've been treating us like slaves. What's the reward? If I make all that effort, I spend years studying in university and I qualify and all that, and I make the grade. I'm not a failure. I'm a person who's very capable of doing the job. And what's my reward? Well, as little as possible.
Right.
Just keep I think it was Daffy in the Bugs Bunny cartoon where he's the goose that lays a golden egg wants to get out of the job and he gives it to Daffy and Daffy thinks, oh, this is brilliant.
Yeah.
And I get fed every day. And then the gangster comes along and says, oh, yeah, I want you to lay a golden egg.
Right.
Daffy eventually manages to do it. And the gangster shows him all these egg cartons.
Fill them all.
Up, duck.
Gotta fill them all.
There is this element in society that we're treating, say, a technical class as if they're machines.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is this objectification of everything. The subject is ignored.
Right. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And of course, this is where we see one of the sharpest differences between the ancient worldview and the modern worldview. The ancient worldview being society needs that diversity of arites. The people who can develop arete in a variety of fields need to be encouraged to do so, because if they don't, it's society itself that suffers. And so if we turn education into a scam where you're going to be in debt for the next 30 years, and that's going to make it hard for you to afford housing and everything else, And then if we make the working conditions be as close to menial as we can make them, with insurance companies telling you what care you are and aren't allowed to give to the patients, even though you've been trained in ethics and you've been trained in how to deliver high quality care, you're being told you're not allowed to, because somebody, a pencil pusher with a spreadsheet, is going to be the one who decides which of your patients get to have which care. It becomes demeaning. So you're in debt. You had to struggle like hard to get that way, and you're being treated in a demeaning fashion. It becomes a trifecta of discouragement, of reasons not to become a doctor. And the long-term consequences are more people get sick and die. That's what happens as a consequence of doing that. But as long as it continues to be rewarding to the spreadsheets in the short term, it's good by the definition of the marketplace. And ergo, it's absolutely good according to the modern epoch. So there's going to be more of this. There's going to be fewer doctors and nurses. That's just how it's going to be. And the prices will just go up and up. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I guess the first thing I want to mention is the root of causality is very complex, particularly in a complex society. And certainly it's not quite like, what's his name, Newton says, you hit a bowling ball, it goes in a certain direction and that's it. I mean, it's like the path, particularly, when it leads another path is continuous, it becomes very complex. That's the first thing I'll mention. The second thing I mention is, I wonder whether you say the media has degenerated to the lowest common denominator. I wonder whether we shouldn't call that the intellect of people is always reverting back to the median, whatever that median is. And to a certain degree, you might conclude that humanity is not as I would say not as capable as we make it out to be, because we want to dumb everything down to fit what the median is. But on the other hand, you might say it's the system that's at fault, because if you have a system that's not full of, how should I say, virtuous people, or at least to a degree for virtuous, and you have people who want to take advantage of the system, then it's going to be manipulated. So in a sense, the system doesn't work. And so you might invent a media that looks at first, when you look at it a positive way, it's going to be good. It's going to be good. But people is going to take advantage of it and manipulate it to a certain degree that in a sense, it will go in a different direction. And that thereby, in a sense, by the very mean of that going in different direction, will be emphasizing a certain kind of a certain psychological dimension that people want, because we all live in a atmosphere of Geist as well. And so if that's the case, like capital, it's very good at that, because it not only, I think the Enlightenment, the flaw they had was that they believed that reason will solve everything. People will think with a straight head and and see what's good. But I think that the people who work in the market eventually saw it differently. People are motivated more by desire than reason. So if you can get them to really want what you want them to want, then that's what they want. You didn't order them. I mean, so that's kind of like the power of soft power. You dangle the thing in front of them, and you somehow made it so appealing that, oh yeah, God, that's what I want, and they believe that's what you want. And in some ways, you couldn't even argue with the market structure, because I guess you asked them and said, oh yeah, that's what I want. I want that big screen TV. I want this and that and that. It's like, so therefore, in a sense, that the median, when it's manipulated, dumbs it down. There's I try to look him up quickly, but there's a European. I guess he was working for Greece as the financial. I guess the financial boss for the Greek government when they were going through the. And he coined this phrase that of, let's say, feudal capitalism. We have evolved to a feudal capitalism, and it's because what happened is this power structure has done it in which they carve up a certain avenues so that you have these, let's say you have, well, the Magnificent Seven. You have them carve up the thing so that it transcends nationalities because they're transnational and they control things in a way. For instance, like Amazon, Amazon has, in a sense, gobbled up all the storefronts so that you are trapped in this feudalism, a new feudalism that's based on the market structure in the media and all that. And so in some sense, you want to go to a different store. You don't. You go there and it has sort of captured all of the stores in this marketplace, so you buy these brands. So even these brands are now part of the, I guess, not a overlord, but the overlord has written above them. So in some sense, I mean, we are in this way in which we're manipulated. No wonder people may no longer desire to listen to, Linda Bernstein. Maybe they didn't want it then, but they certainly don't want it now because there's something that they've been channeled into. So who do you blame? And you can't blame somebody necessarily totally, although they certainly share the blame because after all, that's they actually want, but they were enticed into it. It's kind of like, are you going to blame the dog for salivating because you rang the bell? I mean, like that's a natural response. It's like you coax them into it. So like, I mean, maybe you tell the dog you salivate, I'm going to shoot you in the head. It won't help. It won't help. It's been trained to do that. So what came first?
Yeah.
Did the salivation came first or ringing the bell? I don't know. So I mean, like,
Yeah.
so I think so anytime you have a media, it's like when you have a powerful feudal lore, it's going to consume it and it's going to control it and it's going to become something else. That's what the problem was. One of the problems with technology, besides other problems, that it never turns out to be the way you think it might be, because there's always a degree of pessimism that flows into the system to turn into something else. That's it.
Thanks, Phil.
So,
Okay, I'm going to call on Donald and then we'll go back to the text. What's on your mind, Donald?
Oh, I just don't want Phil to worry. Any society that wants to provide health care to all its members will soon discover it has the power to compel people to become doctors.
I don't think that was my worry. I think that was Rick's worry, not mine.
That was me.
But
yeah,
I hope Donald's being funny there.
he is being funny.
But
Seriously, I mean, a good doctor or whatever, it's an art. It takes a lot of devotion, and you really seriously got to want to do a good job. And this is what I see. I mean, it's like you take your car to get worked on. The situation is not that good anymore. Wasn't that great in the past, but it's a lot worse now.
Well, you find an auto mechanic who really wants to do a good job, and you cleave to them. He's like, this is my guy. I'm never going anywhere else.
Well, it must be perhaps it's true of coders as well.
Yes,
I mean,
the ones who care and the ones who don't. It makes a
yeah,
difference.
yeah. What's the percentage, do you reckon, Rick?
I couldn't begin to guess. I couldn't begin.
I'll tell you, Steve, when I retired as I was a programmer at 70, they all wanted me to stay. You know, there was nobody saying, go out the door, have a good time. You'll love it. You know, it was, we need you back here.
No, Donald, don't go.
Yeah. And it's like, I couldn't do it. But be careful on which aptitude test you do really well on when you're young. You, at some point, society has got to put resources, forcefully if necessary, where it feels it needs them, you know. I think we're still trying to entice people, but maybe not forever, particularly when we're going to deliver a certain service that people have a right to at a given fixed cost. We're going to have to find the labor, whether it's regardless of what doctors are just the topic here. You know, it could be any other, you know, we didn't, you know, we might need physicists. We might need, you know, we're not going to run out of lawyers or MBAs. So,
Yeah. So on that note, let's go back to the text.
I'm just going to say, Donald, you're not thinking of all those people as mere objects. I need a doctor, like I need a part down at Walmart's or something like that. I need this big bulb.
I need a new
I'll go down to Walmart, grab a big bulb. I just hope you're not thinking of doctors in the same way.
Yes.
Well, for thousands of years, our doctors didn't go to medical school.
Right.
You know, I mean, there have been doctors in societies. They're doctors in Greek society, you know.
Not a degree to be found.
Not, yeah, no medical schools. So maybe the quality of this doctor will start to rival your mechanic.
I'm gonna call on Sharon and then take us back to the text. Go ahead, Sharon.
I'm gonna say, I don't think Donald is serious. Definitely not. But one of the things that I think separates all the professions or what you do for a living is your basic humanity. And sitting right next to that is your character. And that's all I have to say, right? I think people who are sick, for the most part, are suffering. People who have either advertently or inadvertently come afoul of the law are also in pain. And I think it's up to us as a society to relieve that suffering because we're human beings.
Thank
you. That's just how I see it. And we're human beings because along the way, we develop character to different degrees. And a society that doesn't take care of its of its disadvantage, I don't know how to judge it, but it's not human.
Right. And it's not sustainable.
Correct.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing up character. That's exactly where paragraph 2 takes us. At the core of every individual self is a heterogeneous character, the logic of its own potential energies, which may not even be coherent with itself. much less structurally congruent with other personalities. So what he's talking about here is diversity of character. He's saying the Greeks understood character to be diverse, not only in the sense of diversifying into different characterological species, which is one kind of diversity. He's saying even within a single individual, their character is formed by diverse principles that do not harmonize perfectly with each other. They are in conflict with each other. This is what Heraclitus talks about. And that it is from the interactions and conflicts of those different principles at work within the person that their personality and behavior emerge, not from any kind of completely harmonic, monotheistic definition of character. He's talking about internal diversity. You have diversity of voices. You have arguments with yourself. You vacillate, you equivocate, right? All these things are possible because our character is diverse internally as well as between people. And even to, as Donald was saying, even to Aristoi, they're the same characterological species, but they're not, they're going to disagree about almost everything, and they're going to be happy to do so, you know, in the ancient Greek world. Even in their old folks' home, they'll be sitting around on their rocking chairs, still arguing with each other, you know, because they're not afraid to disagree with each other. They don't feel a need to be the same as everybody else. They don't find comfort in, well, in inequality, right? They want to find comfort in diversity. So then he goes on. Different as they may be by nature, characters may be comprehended intelligently and rationally according to their inherent predispositions and liabilities. And I'm going to pause there before doing the second half of the sentence to say, so he's saying that, you know, nature may love to hide, but the fingerprints of nature are exposed through the predispositions and liabilities, through the behavior and the decision making. You can see the traces of what's going on. You know, when Heraclitus says the Lord whose oracle is at Delphi neither reveals nor conceals, but gives signs, you know, like the finger pointing to the moon. He's saying nature may not give us all the answers right on the surface where we want them, but it also isn't absolutely obscuring everything. And instead, we're getting hints and clues and indications all the time about the principles that lie underneath. And Kenneth is saying the same applies to the nature within us, our character, as well as the nature without us. We can't know for sure about our own or somebody else's character, but we can see evidence of it indirectly through the things that they do, especially the things they go back to over and over. And so he finishes that sentence, not simply treated preconceptually as if they had to be fundamentally alike. We don't have to a priori say everybody has the same character. It's not necessary. Likewise, we don't have to categorize character prejudicially, as if some inessential traits such as race, age, gender, or ethnic derivation prescribed a law for ways of thinking and behaving, right? All Black people aren't the same. All Jews aren't the same. All women aren't the same. There's an enormous amount of diversity within these categories that we draw and that we kind of over rely on as thought-terminating cliches to think for us or to, you know, prevent us from thinking, as the case may be. So the diversity involved in character, this goes to what Joe was saying earlier about the complexity of resolving these kinds of questions. You know, as long as we keep resorting to caricatures to try to describe human nature or to describe what a just society would be like, we're always going to fall short because that's going to be inadequate. The devil is in the details, as Hegel says, right? To abstract is to be in error. It's the concrete details of what's happening where the fingerprints can be found about people's character, who they are, and what they're inclined to do. You can't just brush over that stuff with broad generalizations, or you're entirely missing what's going on. He continues, this is still paragraph 2, this is the second half of paragraph 2 in section H. Subtle laws, subtle, right, because nature loves to hide, subtle laws bind character to be of the kind it is, right? It is the constellation of principles within us from which our character is generated. That is the nature of our character. These are the subtle laws. And when Heraclitus says character is fate, the Greeks know that the working of fate is subtle. You often can't see until afterwards how it came about. And so When they say character is fate, we're inclined to think about the author writing the foretold outcome, but that's not what they mean at all. They mean this, what he's saying here. Why is somebody the way that they are emerges gradually and indirectly. It takes a while to figure it out. And even then we're not always sure, but we're seeing the even though it expresses itself subtly and indirectly, it also does so inexorably. There is something real underlying those variables and the fog that we're trying to see through. We can sense the presence of a real character within each person as we get to know them. It says, but these laws are internal to the will and judgment of a character, and they express themselves just through the moral confines of what such a type of personality can and cannot make itself desire, do, understand, etc. And I always like to add to his list notice, right? Because that whole issue of foreground, background, the unconscious picking for the conscious mind what it's going to notice and pay attention to in a given situation, that sorting, suppressing the infinity to draw out the synecdoche that's going to stand for the infinity. What is it that we think matters in this situation? Character itself is expressed right then in the moment of noticing and not noticing. Kenneth talks a lot about the way that you can understand a culture is less by the things that they say are important than by the things that they never talk about or notice. The nescience, the surds, the benightedness, where are the dark spots? Because they're not dark by accident, right? The structure of an ideology is to consistently not notice the things that would disprove the ideology. As Kierkegaard says, a delusion is a state of mind in which the thing you most need to think to escape the delusion is exactly what you can't think. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a delusion, right? It would have no power over us. So this is how it is with character as well. Your character is hugely expressed in the things that you never notice. You always notice something else, but not this. That's in some way your signature of who you are. What is suppressed? He says, we only become what we already are, says ancient fatalism. Only the potential an individual is actually pregnant with can be realized. No human being becomes something ex nihilo. So he's saying this, and he means the ancient interpretation to be taken two different ways. And he's emphasizing one of them in this pair of sentences, and that is that there's very little that happens to us entirely by accident. Even when contingency, remember agency and contingency, even when the contingency in a situation is strong and dominant, there will always be some aspect of our own agency that involves us in that situation. Why were we there at that time? Why did we respond to it the way that we did, or not respond the way that we didn't? All of these things are expressing something that's inside of us. And who we develop into as an adult, a lot of that, like, despite all the contingency around us that pushes and shapes us environmentally, there's always going to be an irreducible part of it that comes from within our own character. Why did we respond over and over in the ways that we did? Why did we develop the patterns and habits that we did? This is the way in which someone becomes a doulos or a benausos or an aristos, is through the repetition, the constant return to the same strategies for problem solving. That's what makes those parts of us strong and the other parts of us weak. And thus we become the caricature of a whole person. But he also means it the other way, and so did the ancients. It's not just that looking at you now, what we're seeing is the oak that grew from the acorn, right? That's half of it, but it's not all of it. The other half of it is, even now as an oak, you are also an acorn. You are the seeds of your future self. There is potential in you that has not yet expressed itself. And this is why it's so hard to pin down human character. We can't say that who you are now is the full extent of who you could be, because all the seeds that are within you that have the potential, if nurtured, to develop into some dramatic new direction, they're there, even if we don't see them currently being expressed. And this is where we get into trouble if we grow complacent and start to think that we know ourselves, or we start to think that we know other people. This is the shortcut to the prejudiced mind that says all black people are like this, all Jews are like that. It does it because it's forgotten this lesson of ancient wisdom, which is you are not just how you appear right now. And you are not even just those parts of your character that are currently actively, openly expressing themselves. You're more than that. You are also all these other parts of your character that are still waiting to unfold from the bud into the bloom. And that's what makes this problem so hard. That's why Heraclitus says, you couldn't find the limits of soul, even if you spent your whole life searching, such as its profundity. It's an infinite subject. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is actually speaking to the importance of studying our preferences. Just so there's the idea of the preconceived notions, like why do I believe this to be the case in the first place? Because when you look at your preferences and why they exist in the first place, it starts to reveal the blind spots or the irrational aspects, if you may, like the parts that you're actually not capturing in that in your analysis. And this is part of the idea of like, well, maybe I should like, maybe it ought to be better this way. And this is why comes to your point about limitations as well, is that, how do we get past our current limitations? We don't even necessarily understand them. And so that this is all kind of interrelated, but it starts with the idea of asking yourself why you're doing something in the first place and why you actually prefer that versus this. And then is there something like, how does it relate to a more of a philosophy of life, I guess, is the best way I can put it just at this moment. But, in the sense of the grand goal of living. No, but all of this, again, this is an internal process, and it's not something you can be shamed into doing.
Yeah, that's right. People outside of you don't have as much access to what's going on inside you as you do. Even though we are obscure even to ourselves, we do have more access to what's going on in there. We have that opportunity to explore our preferences and explore the things that we never try. This last week, I've gone obsessed about Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. I've been playing it over and over, and I've been playing lots of different performances of it. And part of the reason is I can't believe I didn't grow up with it. In my household, we played Beethoven's Fifth Symphony all the time. But Beethoven composed the Fifth and Sixth at the exact same time, and he premiered them to the world in the same single concert, back to back, because he conceived of them dialectically. There are no music critics to talk about this. He conceived of them dialectically. One is the struggle of the will, dun, 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 right, against all the forces of society. And the other one is about the lawfulness of nature, the cycles of nature. It's about, how if we go out into the natural world and attend to it, it drains away that strife from us and heals us and allows us to reconnect with what it is that we need to be harmonizing with. And the structure of the two symphonies couldn't be more different. And they're meant to go together. But throughout the 20th century, everybody loves the Fifth, and the Sixth is like an embarrassment. Oh God, he's indulging in nature painting, and that's so lowbrow. I can't believe Beethoven would do that. But Beethoven understood better about the dialectic between man and nature, right? That we have to have both parts. And I grew up with only one of them. And so now I'm just playing the heck out of the Sixth Symphony. I can't get enough of it.
So Rick, the Fifth Symphony, da, 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 da. So then how does the other one start?
Da, 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 da.
Oh,
It's very peaceful. It's in Fantasia, the film, the part with all the centaurs in Disney's film.
right.
Is it? I'll put a link to a really good performance before we end up in a few minutes. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, now that you mentioned Beethoven and the fourth and the fifth and the sixth symphony, nature and the will, I'm puzzled what I should respond to. I'll just respond briefly. I can authenticate that's true, because there was a time when I was doing my fallen angels, and I was also doing landscape painting. And even though some of the techniques I use are very similar. When I was doing it, I feel very differently. So that's true. Nature has a way of, let's say, how that you're in it and you're more you're a little bit more lost in yourself, and you're in harmony with nature, and so it's much more a calming atmosphere. Whereas when you look into yourself, it's much more of a struggle. So I'll authenticate that. But I want to get to the other part that's important. I was going to say first is that, of course, Kenneth has the added wisdom of living in modern life. But it seems like what he's saying is that the Greeks had a precursor of Freud, of the unconscious. Because one way you can look at the unconscious is the relation between the visible and the invisible. But I'm not sure whether, to what degree the unconscious or even the subconscious surface into consciousness, into being itself. I mean, I believe in it, but I'm not sure how it does it. And certainly dreaming do it to a certain degree, but on the other hand, you don't have total access to dreams, and I guess you could take notes or whatever. But how does one get into something that is supposed to be hidden deep within you, but is somehow there's a drive that's within you? I mean, one way, I suppose, is you go to a professional, or somehow, of course, they're not you, but somehow they have some artistic techniques, some the art of penetrating into your unconscious. And I was thinking also that the American school of psychiatry and the European school of psychoanalysis is completely different, because the American think of it as kind of a science that is much more on the surface, and we could treat it much more directly, and usually drug therapy would do the job easily. Whereas the Europeans still think of it, well, by and large, I don't know if all Europeans are that way, but by and large think of it more as a kind of art form that you sort of tease out through deep kind of analysis, and so of course it's, quote, much less efficient, like than popping a pill. So I remember when that sort of beginning to surface itself in American psychology, like between psychotherapy and essentially drug therapy. And it's like there was kind of an intense, I guess, struggle in the discipline itself. So that's interesting. One is, I'm not saying it's looking backward, but it performs the fact that it's a much more mysterious thing. And the other one is that, oh yeah, we know the mechanics, it's like that we can fix it very easily. Oh, well, we're gonna get very near it in some sense. So we have a much more analytical, scientific point of view in a way. So I just want to, because like, how can one be one's own psychotherapist in a way? I mean, you could maybe do a lot of, like automatic writing and journaling.
Yes.
Maybe that'll come out. Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Is that how you do it?
It helps a lot.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It's called insight.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So on that note, I guess we wrap up here for this week, and we're 2 paragraphs in to section H. I think we're doing well. That's faster paced than we did section G. And this is what I thought, right? He's culminating the ideas we've now been exposed to. and so it's getting easier to see what he's talking about. So we'll pick up with paragraph 3 next week. Except Sharon has something she wants to add. Go ahead, Sharon.
Yes, I just want to say something. I mean, in the development of character, I see that as primarily an individual pursuit. And I think the Greeks call it knowing thyself. In modern day, I look at it as the work of personhood. And the work of personhood to a totally evolved human being is very hard. And at the center of that is self-love.
Mm-hmm.
Very few human beings love themselves. And self-love is closely linked to character. This topic is very, very fascinating to me because it's something that I've thought a lot about my life. It's who you become is a combination of what you come with, your nature, but also the environment around you and what you take from it, and what your mistakes, your experience, your judgment, and the wisdom that you eventually develop. It's a complex process, but it goes on continuously.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, it's one of my favorite areas. This is I like Section H. It's going to be really interesting. So we'll pick up with paragraph 3 next week.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ginny.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, David.
Take care.